A black horse collapses on a dirt road at the exact hour the sun turns cruel, and the man riding it does not get up. Dust settles over both of them like a shroud nobody has agreed to yet. Somewhere behind a fence line, a woman with cracked hands and a dry well watches through a cloud of heat, and she has exactly one choice left that will not cost her everything. She has already lost the only man she ever loved to a debt she is still paying. She is about to lose the last water she owns to a stranger she does not know. By morning, the empty road behind her house will not be empty anymore. Before this story pulls you into a valley dying of thirst, one truth has to sit with you first. Marcella Vance sold every horse her husband ever loved to pay off hospital bills, and she kept nothing of him but a barn with no animals in it. So when a dying stranger's horse breaks down in front of her gate, she is not just deciding whether to give away her last water. She is deciding whether to let anything into that barn again. If you have ever guarded an empty room because filling it again felt too dangerous, you already understand her before she says a word. Like this video, subscribe if stories like this one find you, and tell me in the comments which city or town you are watching from tonight. Now let the valley speak first, because out here, the land always talks before the people do. The valley sits low between two ridgelines that used to hold snow past April, and now hold nothing but scorched grass and the memory of water. Farmers in this part of the country call it the Hollow, though no map has ever printed that name. It is the kind of place a person only finds by already knowing someone who lives there, or by getting lost badly enough to stop caring where the road leads. For 3 years the rain has come light and left early, and the small ranches strung along the base of the mountains have thinned out one by one, sold off, fenced shut, or simply abandoned to the wind. Marcella Vance's property sits at the far edge of that dying chain, a modest stretch of 15 acres with a farmhouse the color of old bone and a barn that has not sheltered a horse in 4 years. The paint on the barn doors has peeled into long gray curls. The stalls inside stand empty, swept clean out of habit rather than need, the way a person keeps a child's room untouched long after the child is gone. Marcella is 52, and the years show mostly in her hands, roughened from irrigation lines and fence repair, and in the particular stillness she carries when she stands at her kitchen window in the evenings, looking toward the barn instead of away from it. Her husband, Thomas Vance, ran a modest but respected breeding operation on this land for over 20 years. Neighbors still speak of the quality of his horses in the same tone they use for weather that no longer comes. He died 3 winters ago, slow and expensive, the kind of illness that eats a family's savings a little at a time until the savings are gone and the illness keeps eating anyway. Marcella sold the horses one at a time during his last year, then the equipment, then anything with resale value that would not be missed at a glance. She did not tell him about most of it. He asked about the horses only once, near the end, and she told him they were fine, out at pasture, resting. He believed her, or let her believe he did. Since his death, she has kept the smallest possible operation alive, enough vegetables and goats to trade in town, enough discipline to keep the property from sliding into ruin, and enough distance from her neighbors to avoid the particular kindness that feels, to her, indistinguishable from pity. The well on her land has always run low in summer, but this year it runs lower than she has ever measured it, and the small irrigation pond behind her fence line, fed by a spring that trickles down from the ridge, has shrunk to a brown ring surrounded by cracked mud. She has been rationing that pond water for 6 weeks, measuring it out in buckets, watching the mud crack wider every morning like a wound that will not close. It is into this heat, on the 17th day, without a single cloud, that a rider appears on the road below her fence, moving at a pace no sane traveler would choose in the middle of the afternoon. From a distance, Marcella mistakes the shape for a mirage, a common enough trick of the light out here. She does not stop what she is doing, which is coiling a length of cracked irrigation hose near the empty pond, until the shape does not dissolve the way mirages do. It keeps moving, wrong in a way that pulls her attention fully off the hose and onto the road. The horse under the rider is black, or was black once, now dulled gray with dust and lathered sweat that has dried into a crust along its neck. Its gait has the loose, staggering rhythm of an animal running past the edge of what its body can give. The rider slumps low over its neck, not from skill but from something closer to collapse, one hand tangled in the mane, the other hanging loose at his side. 50 yards from her gate, The horse's legs fold beneath it all at once, and the rider goes down with it, hard, into the dirt at the edge of the road. Marcella does not move for 3 full seconds. It is long enough to notice her own hesitation, long enough for something old and reflexive to rise in her chest and be pushed back down. Then she is moving, dropping the hose, crossing the yard fast enough that her boots kick up small clouds of dry dust behind her, because whatever debt she is still paying to her husband's memory, whatever careful distance she has built between herself and the world since his death, none of it survives the sight of a horse down in the road and a man not moving beside it. Up close, the horse's condition is worse than the distance suggested. Its ribs show sharp beneath the sweat-darkened coat. Its breath comes in short, rasping pulls, and its eyes have the glassy, unfocused look of an animal deep into heat exhaustion, close enough to organ failure that minutes, not hours, will decide the outcome. The man beside it lies on his back where he fell, one leg still tangled in a stirrup, his hat gone somewhere along the last stretch of road. His lips are cracked white at the corners. A canvas satchel is strapped tight across his chest, the buckle dug into his collarbone as if he tightened it deliberately before losing consciousness, as if some part of him fought to protect whatever is inside it even as the rest of him gave out. Marcella kneels first beside the man, 2 fingers pressed to his throat, feeling for a pulse that comes fast and thin. She calls out to him, short and sharp, the way a person calls to someone standing too close to a ledge. His eyelids flutter, but do not open. She looks once toward her house, toward the phone line that has not carried a signal reliably in years, toward the nearest neighbor 4 miles down a road that will take 20 minutes to reach even if someone is home to answer a knock. There is no ambulance coming to the hollow in under an hour, and the man in front of her does not have an hour, and neither does the horse. What she has, instead of help, is a pond behind her fence with perhaps 4 days of rationed water left in it. If she is careful, if the heat breaks, if nothing else goes wrong, she does not decide so much as act, the decision arriving in her body before it reaches her thoughts. She hauls 2 buckets from the barn, the same buckets she has used every morning for 6 weeks to measure exactly how much water she can spare, and she fills them from the pond without measuring at all. The mud sucks at her boots as she wades to the deepest remaining pocket of water. When she comes back to the road, she pours the first bucket in slow measures along the horse's muzzle, wetting a rag to press against its neck and legs, working with the practiced economy of someone who spent 2 decades married to a horseman even if she never once called herself one. The horse's ears flick weakly toward her. Its breathing does not improve at first, and for a moment she stands over it with the empty bucket loose in her hand, watching for a change that refuses to come. She empties the second bucket over the man instead, wetting his shirt, his throat, his hairline, and this time the response is immediate. His eyes open, unfocused, catching on the sky before finding her face above him. He does not speak. His hand moves instead, weak and searching, toward the satchel at his chest, checking the buckle with fingers that barely have strength to close around it. Only after confirming it is still fastened does his hand fall back to the dirt. She half drags, half guides him into the thin shade thrown by a leaning fence post, the only shade for 50 yards in either direction, and goes back for more water, this time from the well itself, the one source she has protected most fiercely all summer, rationing it for her goats and her own kitchen with a discipline that has kept her alive through worse droughts than this one. She does not hesitate over that decision either. She fills a jar and holds it to his lips, tilting it slow enough that he does not choke, watching his throat work in small, desperate pulls. By the time the worst of the heat begins to loosen its grip on the valley, the horse is standing again, unsteady but upright, and the man is sitting propped against the fence post, blinking the world into focus with the particular disorientation of someone who did not expect to open his eyes again. He looks at her for a long moment before he manages words, and when they come, they are rough, stripped down to their essentials. "I owe you." She tells him he does not, that anyone would have done the same, though even as she says it, some private part of her recognizes the shape of a lie. Not everyone would have emptied a well running dry in the 17th rainless day for a stranger collapsed on the road. She knows several neighbors, decent people, who would have hesitated long enough to let both the horse and the rider die of their own caution. He introduces himself as Leland, offers no last name yet, and does not ask hers in return, too depleted still to manage the courtesy. His eyes go instead to the satchel across his chest, checking it a second time with the same wordless urgency. And something in that repeated gesture tells her this stranger is carrying more than personal belongings across a dying valley in the worst heat of the year. She notices, in the fading light, the particular calluses across his palms, the wear pattern of a man who has spent years with his hands inside animals rather than merely on top of them, setting bones and drawing blood, and doing the unglamorous work that keeps a struggling ranch's stock alive through seasons like this one. There is a scar along his forearm, old and pale, the kind left by a spooked horse rather than any accident of carelessness, and she finds herself cataloging these details the way a person studies a stranger they suspect they will need to trust before the night is finished. The sun drops another degree toward the ridgeline. Marcella looks at her pond, half drained now in the fading light, and does not let herself calculate the cost out loud. The horse shifts its weight from one leg to another, testing itself, and lets out a low breath through its nose that carries something close to relief. Leland's hand finds its neck without him seeming to notice he has moved it, an old, practiced gesture repeated so many times across so many animals that it no longer requires thought. Marcella watches the two of them for a moment, man and horse both rebuilding themselves out of the same borrowed water, and something in the sight pulls at a memory she has spent 3 years keeping at a careful distance. She turns back toward the house before the memory can finish arriving, gathering the empty buckets, giving her hands something to do. By the time she returns with a third round of water, the worst of the crisis has visibly passed. The horse stands under its own weight now, unsteady but upright, ears no longer pinned flat with distress. Leland has managed to sit upright against the fence post, one arm braced across his knee, breathing in long, deliberate pulls as though relearning the rhythm of it. He does not thank her again. He only watches her cross the yard, the low sun throwing her shadow long across the dirt ahead of her, and something in his expression settles into an attention that has less to do with gratitude and more to do with recognition. The particular way one person sometimes sees, all at once, the shape of what another has been carrying alone. She does not send him away, not with the horse still trembling on unsteady legs and the nearest help hours distant even under better circumstances. Instead, she leads them both toward the barn, the horse first, guiding it by a length of rope she keeps coiled by the gate out of habit rather than use, and the man following slow and silent behind her, one hand braced against the fence rail for balance. The barn doors groan open on hinges that have not needed to move in longer than she likes to admit. Inside, the air smells of dust and old hay and the particular staleness of a space that has kept its shape without keeping its purpose. For empty stalls stretch along one wall, swept and orderly, waiting for animals that are never coming back. Leland's horse steps into the nearest stall and stands there trembling, head low, and something crosses the man's face at the sight of the empty stalls around it, a flicker of understanding he does not voice. Marcella works through the evening with the mechanical focus of someone avoiding her own thoughts, mixing a mash of oats and water she keeps for her goats, but has never once fed to a horse in this barn, checking the animal's legs for swelling, listening to its breathing settle by degrees as the worst of the exhaustion passes. Leland sits on an overturned crate near the stall door, too weak yet to do much beyond watch, his satchel still strapped across his chest, even now, even here, safe inside four walls. It is well past dark before he tells her anything close to the truth. He is a veterinarian by trade, itinerant, moving between the scattered ranches of the region that cannot afford or reach a permanent clinic. He also carries messages and medical supplies between communities too far apart and too poor for reliable mail, an unofficial network held together by trust more than infrastructure. In the satchel, wrapped in oilcloth against the heat, are documents meant for a distant ranch further up the mountain road, along with vials of medicinal serum critical to controlling an outbreak of strangles moving through the region's horse populations, an illness that can gut a small operation's entire stock in a matter of weeks if left unchecked. He had been 3 days on the road when the heat caught him between water sources, a miscalculation he does not excuse or soften, stating it flatly. The way a man states a mistake he has already spent hours punishing himself for in silence. He does not know what would have happened if she had not been standing at her fence line at that particular hour. Marcella listens without much comment, tending the horse, refilling water, moving through the barn with the kind of quiet competence that makes questions unnecessary. When she finally does speak, it is not about him. It is a short, almost involuntary remark about the empty stalls around them, an observation offered without context, the kind of thing said aloud only because the silence has grown too heavy to hold alone. Leland does not press her on it. He watches her instead, the careful way she avoids looking directly at the stalls even while standing inside them. And something in his expression settles into a recognition that has nothing to do with medicine. Outside, the wind picks up as the temperature drops, carrying the dry, mineral smell of the mountains down into the valley. Marcella steps out of the barn once to check the sky, an old habit from years of watching for rain that rarely comes anymore, and finds instead a scatter of unusually bright stars over the ridgeline, the kind of clear night that makes distances feel both closer and more impossible at once. When she returns, Leland is standing at the stall door, running a slow hand along his horse's neck, and he does not look at her as he speaks. This debt does not end tonight. She tells him the debt is settled, that a bucket of water does not require repayment, that he should rest and be on his way at first light before the heat returns. He does not argue the point directly. He simply looks toward the barn's back wall, toward a stretch of old, weathered wood near the tack room door, and something in his gaze lingers there a beat too long before he lets it go. She does not think much of it that night. She has no reason yet to. Sleep does not come easily. She lies awake listening to the unfamiliar sound of a horse shifting in the barn, a sound the house has not held in for years, and finds it stranger than she expects. Not unwelcome exactly, but disruptive in the way any long silence is disrupted by the return of something it had learned to live without. Twice she rises and stands at the bedroom window, looking out at the dark shape of the barn against a sky gone thick with stars, and twice she talks herself back to bed without quite deciding what she is watching for. Before dawn, she is up again out of old habit, moving through the kitchen in the gray half-light, and it is only as she steps out onto the porch with her cup of well water that she notices Leland already awake ahead of her, standing near the paddock fence with his satchel slung back across his chest, checking his horse's legs one final time before the ride ahead. He does not see her at first. There is something in the careful, unhurried way he works, running his hands down each leg in turn, that suggests a man taking his time with something he does not often get to do slowly. And for a moment the whole scene holds the quality of a memory rather than a morning, familiar in a way that has nothing to do with either of them having met before yesterday. Leland leaves before the sun fully clears the ridgeline, his horse recovered enough for slow travel, though he keeps its pace deliberately gentle down the length of her drive. Marcella watches from the porch with a cup of well water in her hand, more out of habit than thirst, and does not call out a farewell. She is not prepared. He stops once at the gate, turns his horse partway back toward the house, and for a moment it looks as though he might say something more. Instead, he only nods, a small, formal gesture, and rides on until the dust of the road swallows him whole. She does not think about him again until mid-morning, when the goats need moving to shade, and she passes through the barn on her way to the back pasture gate. It is the tack room door that catches her eye first, the wood beside its frame, where something has been cut fresh into the grain, clean-edged and deliberate in a way that no accident or old work could produce. She stops in the doorway, feed bucket still in hand, and steps closer. The mark is small, no larger than her palm, cut with what must have been a pocket knife worked with patience rather than haste. It is not a random scratch. It resembles a horseshoe split open at the center by a single straight line, a symbol she does not recognize from any brand or ranch mark she has seen in this valley in 30 years of living in it. Beneath it, carved in smaller, plainer letters, are two words: Debt Honored. She stands looking at it longer than the moment requires, feed bucket forgotten at her side, turning the phrase over the way a person turns over a coin found somewhere it should not be. It does not read like gratitude exactly. It reads like a promise, or a warning, or both at once, the kind of thing carved by a man who expected it to be found and understood by more than the woman who fed him. She tells herself it means nothing more than what it says, a stranger's private ritual of thanks before riding on, and she almost convinces herself of that by the time she finishes her chores. The feeling does not hold. Something about the confidence of the carving, the precision of it, the sense that it was placed there not for her private comfort, but as a marker meant to be visible, sits uneasy in her chest through the rest of the morning. The unease sharpens considerably when, just past noon, a truck she does not recognize turns off the main road and comes rattling up her drive, throwing a long tail of dust behind it in the windless heat. She recognizes the man who steps out of it before he has fully closed the door, not from friendship, but from reputation. Barnaby Kincaid runs the largest lending operation in the county seat, a business built less on generosity than on timing, on buying up small debts at a discount and calling them due at the worst possible moment for the people who owe them. Beside him climbs a second man in a county badge and a tired, non-committal expression, introduced without warmth as the local judge of peace, a man named Wexler who does not meet Marcella's eyes for longer than necessary. Kincaid does not waste time on pleasantries. He holds a folded document at arm's length, tapping it once against his palm before extending it toward her, and explains, in the flat, rehearsed cadence of a man who has delivered this particular speech many times before, that an old county tax lien on her property, one she believed settled years earlier through a payment plan tied to her husband's estate, has resurfaced under a clause she never fully understood and certainly never agreed to in the terms he now describes. The amount owed, he informs her, has compounded considerably. The deadline for payment, or for vacating the property entirely, is 24 hours from the moment the paper touches her hand. Marcella does not take the paper immediately. She looks instead at Wexler, searching his face for the reassurance that this cannot possibly be legal, that no county process moves this fast or this cruelly, and finds only a tired, sideways glance that offers her nothing. Kincaid's eyes drift once, briefly, toward the open barn doors behind her, toward the fresh pale scar of the carving visible even from this distance in the harsh midday light, and something calculating crosses his expression before he masks it back into professional indifference. He tells her, almost as an afterthought, that word travels fast in a valley this small, that he has already heard about her stranger and his horse, and that whatever debts she imagines herself collecting from mountain riders and wandering veterinarians will mean nothing to a county judge when the deadline passes. He says it lightly, the way a man says something he wants to sound casual, but has clearly rehearsed for effect. And it is only after his truck disappears back down the drive in its cloud of dust that Marcella allows herself to feel the full weight of what has just happened. 24 hours. A carved warning in her barn wall she does not yet understand. A stranger's promise that a debt would be honored, made to a woman who has nothing left to lose except the one thing she still has. She spends the better part of an hour after Kincaid's truck disappears simply standing in her kitchen, the document spread flat on the table under both palms, as though pressing on it might change what it says. The numbers do not soften on a second reading, nor a third. She thinks of the accounts she closed one by one during Thomas's last year. The equipment sold at a fraction of its worth to buyers who knew exactly how little bargaining room a dying man's wife had left, the particular exhaustion of having already done this once and being asked, now, to do it again with even less to sell. She walks out to the barn sometime past noon, not for any task that needs doing, but because the empty stalls have always been where she goes when the house grows too loud with its own silence. She stands a long while in front of the carved mark beside the tackroom door, running 2 fingers over the shallow grooves the way a person reads something in the dark. That honored. She does not know yet what those 2 words are worth, whether they carry any weight beyond a stranger's private gratitude, or whether she has simply spent her last reserves of water on a kindness that will vanish into the dust along with everything else Kincaid intends to take from her. The uncertainty sits heavier than the deadline itself, because at least the deadline has a shape she understands. The afternoon passes in a blur of arithmetic Marcella has performed too many times before, calculating exactly how little time and how few options she has left. She does not have the money Kincaid demands, not close to it, not if she sold every remaining animal and every tool on the property by morning. She sits at her kitchen table as the light turns gold and then gray, the tax document open in front of her, its language dense and hostile in the particular way legal papers become when they are written to be understood only by the people writing them. It is the sound of hooves on the drive, plural this time, unhurried but deliberate, that pulls her from the table well after dark. She goes to the porch expecting perhaps a single rider, a neighbor come to check on rumors already spreading through the valley's thin network of gossip. What she finds instead is 6 riders sitting their horses in a loose half-circle at the edge of her yard, lanterns hung from 2 of the saddles casting long, moving shadows across the dirt. At the center of the group sits a broad-shouldered man well into his 60s, gray-bearded, dressed plain, his posture holding the particular ease of someone who has spent a lifetime more comfortable on a horse than off one. He introduces himself simply as Otis, offers no title, though the way the other riders arrange themselves slightly behind him leaves little doubt about his standing among them. Beside him sits a younger woman, sharp-eyed, watchful, who Marcella will later come to know as Iris, and who says almost nothing this first night beyond studying Marcella's face with an intensity that feels closer to evaluation than curiosity. Otis explains, without much preamble, that they are the loose association of small breeders, ranch families, and rural first responders scattered through the mountain communities above the valley, bound together less by formal charter than by shared necessity and a stubborn commitment to keeping the land in the hands of the families who have worked it for generations. They call themselves, when they call themselves anything at all, the Mountain Riders, though the name carries more weight in practice than in ceremony. Word of Leland's collapse and Marcella's water reached them by the following dawn, carried up the mountain by a relay of riders who move information across the region faster and more reliably than any phone line that reaches this far out. The mark on her barn wall, Otis tells her, is not decoration. It is recognition, cut by Leland's own hand, a signal understood among their loose network that a debt of life has been incurred and must be answered. It is a custom old enough that none of the riders present can say exactly where it began, only that it has held for as long as anyone remembers, passed down through families who understand what it costs a community to lose even one water source, one act of mercy, one household willing to give when giving costs everything. Marcella listens to this with a wariness she does not fully hide, the caution of a woman who has learned that unexpected generosity from strangers usually arrives with strings attached, sometimes visible, sometimes not. She tells them plainly about Kincaid's visit, about the 24-hour deadline now closer to 12, about a debt she cannot pay regardless of custom or symbol or promise carved into old wood. Otis receives this news without visible surprise, exchanging a brief glance with Iris that suggests Kincaid's name is not new to this group. What follows is not the simple charity Marcella braces herself for. Otis explains, with the careful economy of a man who has negotiated difficult terms before, that the riders are prepared to pay Kincaid's claim in full, clearing the lien and the immediate threat to her land. But the offer arrives with a condition attached, one he lays out plainly rather than softening. In exchange, they are asking for her permission to establish, on a portion of her property, a permanent way station and rescue shelter for horses displaced or abandoned by the drought sweeping the region, a hub connected to their existing network of care that stretches across the mountain communities. It would mean her barn filled again, her empty stalls given purpose, her isolation traded for a constant, unpredictable presence of riders, animals, and strangers passing through land she has spent 3 years guarding as a private monument to grief. It would mean opening the one place she has kept sealed against the world since her husband's death. Iris speaks for the first time at real length then, describing the shelters already scattered through the higher mountain communities, small operations run by widows and retired ranch hands and families who lost their own stock to disease or dead in years past, each one built from the same principle, that an empty stall helps no one and a filled one, however unpredictable the cost, keeps something alive that would otherwise be lost to the drought entirely. She does not romanticize the arrangement. She tells Marcella plainly that the work is hard, unglamorous, occasionally heartbreaking when an animal cannot be saved, and that the constant presence of strangers on her land will test a solitude Marcella has clearly built with great care over several difficult years. Otis adds little to this beyond a final, quieter observation, delivered almost as an aside while gathering his reins to leave. He tells her that Leland's mark has been carved into perhaps a dozen barns across 3 counties in his lifetime, and that every single household that answered it has said, without exception, that the hardest part was never the labor or the strangers. It was deciding, after so long spent protecting an absence, to let it be filled by something that might also, eventually, be lost. Marcella does not answer that night. She stands on her porch long after the riders have gone, lanterns swinging away down the dark road, and looks back at the barn behind her, its doors still open from the morning's chores, its empty stalls visible in the thin moonlight, waiting the way they have waited for 4 years for something she has never let herself want again. Before Otis mounts to leave, he pauses at the base of the porch steps, hat in hand, and offers her something closer to a warning than a farewell. He tells her, plainly, that Kincaid has crossed paths with the riders before, that the man's grievance with their loose, informal claim on mountain land runs deeper than any single lien or deadline, rooted in years of failed attempts to buy up the smaller ranches one collapse at a time. Whatever she decides tonight, he says, will not stay a private matter for long. Iris adds nothing to this, only watches Marcella's face for a reaction the way she has watched it all evening, cataloging something Marcella cannot quite name. Alone again, Marcella walks the length of her fence line in the dark, counting the paces the way she once counted them with Thomas, back when the sound of horses in the paddock was ordinary enough to go unnoticed. She thinks of every year she has spent keeping this land small and quiet and entirely her own, a fortress built less against the world than against her own capacity to lose something a second time. The offer on the table is not simple charity. It is an ending to one kind of solitude and the beginning of a risk she has spent 3 years specifically engineering her life to avoid. She does not sleep that night either. When the first gray light finally touches the ridgeline, she is still sitting on the porch steps, the tax document folded in her lap, the barn's empty doorway dark and waiting behind her, and somewhere in the hours between midnight and dawn, without any single dramatic moment she could later point to, the decision finishes making itself. Kincaid arrives precisely as the deadline expires, his truck pulling into the yard alongside Wexler's county vehicle just as the first gray light of morning touches the ridgeline. He carries the same folded confidence he brought the day before, clearly expecting to find an empty house, a hurried departure, or at best a woman broken enough to sign whatever he places in front of her. What he finds instead stops him a half step short of the porch. The yard is full. 6 riders from the previous night have returned, joined now by a dozen more, horses and trucks, and a small gathering of ranch families spread across the dirt in loose clusters, quiet, watchful, clearly present for a purpose that has nothing to do with hospitality. Leland stands near the barn doors, recovered fully now, his satchel still strapped across his chest, and beside him stands Otis, arms folded, unhurried, meeting Kincaid's approach with the calm of a man who has anticipated exactly this confrontation. Marcella stands at the center of it, on the porch steps, the tax document from the day before held loosely in one hand, and when she speaks, her voice carries further across the yard than she likely intends, steady in a way that surprises even her. I am not signing anything today. Kincaid's composure slips only slightly, a tightening around his eyes before the practiced smoothness returns. He gestures toward the gathered riders, dismissing them with a wave that fails to hide the calculation behind it, and reminds Wexler, loudly enough for the yard to hear, that unauthorized gatherings on contested property carry their own legal weight, that this display changes nothing about the lien or the deadline that has now technically passed. It is Leland who steps forward then, not with confrontation but with paper of his own, drawn from the satchel he has guarded across 3 days of near-death travel. He lays out, calmly and without theatrics, the documentation he was originally carrying toward the mountain ranch before the heat brought him down. Medical and veterinary records tracking the strangles outbreak moving through the valley's horse populations over the past 2 months, records that show, in careful, undeniable detail, exactly which operations have survived the outbreak intact and exactly why. Every surviving ranch on the list has one thing in common: a connection to the informal network of care and shared resources the mountain riders have maintained through the worst of the drought, a network that has kept disease contained and animals alive across a region the county's own agricultural office has largely abandoned to its fate. Wexler takes the papers with visible reluctance, scanning them in the harsh early light, and something shifts perceptibly in his posture as he reads. He asks Kincaid, in a tone considerably less deferential than the day before, whether the county lien Kincaid is enforcing was properly filed through the agricultural exemption process that protects working ranches during declared drought emergencies, a process Kincaid has conveniently failed to mention at any point in his dealings with Marcella. Kincaid's answer comes too fast, too defensive, and the crack in his certainty widens further when Iris steps forward with a second folder, this one containing records of at least 3 other small ranches in the valley pressured under similarly irregular liens in the past year, all timed to arrive during moments of maximum vulnerability, all resolved through forced sales at prices well below fair value, all funneling eventually into holdings connected to Kincaid's lending operation. Kincaid attempts one final push, turning to Marcella directly and reminding her, in a tone gone suddenly softer and more personal, that she is one signature away from ending all of this cleanly, from selling before the county drags her name through a public review alongside his, from keeping at least some measure of the privacy she has clearly valued enough to defend for years. It is a calculated appeal, aimed at the exact wound he glimpsed the day before at the edge of her barn doors, and for a moment it lands, a flicker of old exhaustion crossing her face at the thought of her family's finances laid open for the whole valley to examine. She looks past him instead, toward the barn, toward the carved mark she can just make out from this distance, toward the dozen faces in her yard who came without being asked twice. Whatever privacy she is being offered, she seems to measure it now against a solitude that has already cost her 3 years and finds it wanting. The yard grows very quiet. Wexler folds the papers slowly, looking between Kincaid and the gathered riders with the expression of a man recalculating a decision he made too quickly the day before. He states, with the careful, formal language of someone protecting himself as much as anyone else, that the lien enforcement will be suspended pending a full county review of the agricultural exemption filing, effective immediately, and that any attempt to force removal or seizure before that review concludes would constitute a serious legal liability for anyone involved in enforcing it. Kincaid does not accept the reversal gracefully. His composure finally breaks in full, his voice rising as he accuses the gathered riders of orchestrating an illegal blockade, of intimidating county officials, of building an unregulated operation on land that was never legally cleared for it. It is Marcella, still standing on her porch steps, who answers him this time, and her voice does not rise to meet his. You had 24 hours to take everything I have left. I am giving these people the same amount of time you gave me, and see what grows instead of what you would have taken. The silence that follows holds long enough for Kincaid to understand, fully and finally, that the ground beneath his leverage has shifted in a direction he cannot reverse. He retreats to his truck without another word, Wexler following a moment later, and the sound of both engines fading down the drive carries with it the last of the immediate threat, though not. Marcella understands even in that moment, the last of the consequences still to come. For a long moment after the dust settles, no one in the yard moves. It is the kind of stillness that follows any fight decided rather than finished, the adrenaline still working through bodies that do not yet trust the danger has actually passed. Marcella looks down at the tax document still folded in her hand, its threat suddenly smaller than the paper it is printed on, and feels something in her chest loosen that has been wound tight since the moment Kincaid's truck first appeared on her drive. Otis is the one who breaks the silence, calling out an order to 2 of the younger riders to start unloading fence posts and lumber from the truck bed parked near the barn. And just like that, the yard shifts from confrontation back into motion, into the ordinary business of building something rather than defending it. Leland folds his documents away with the same careful precision he used to draw them out, and when he glances toward Marcella, there is no triumph in his expression, only the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally settled on terms neither of them fully anticipated 3 days earlier. Marcella does not join the work right away. She stands alone at the edge of the yard a while longer, watching strangers unload lumber onto ground that has belonged to no one but her and her grief for 3 long years, and something in her throat tightens that she does not let show on her face. It is not regret. She recognizes it only slowly, watching Iris laugh at something one of the younger riders says, watching Leland run a hand along the fence line already measuring where new stalls might go, as something closer to the particular ache of a door finally opening after being kept shut so long the hinges had nearly rusted through. The weeks that follow move faster than any stretch of time Marcella has known since her husband's death. The county review, once opened, moves with unusual speed once the agricultural exemption records surface publicly, and Kincaid's lending operation finds itself facing scrutiny from state regulators over the pattern of irregular liens Iris's documentation first exposed. He does not disappear from the valley entirely. His business too established to collapse overnight, but his influence over the smaller ranches thins considerably, and the county commercial board, faced with the evidence Leland carried across 3 days of near-fatal travel, formally votes to exclude him from any future emergency drought negotiations, a decision reported without much sympathy in the regional paper. Marcella's barn does not stay empty long. Within a month, 3 horses arrive from a collapsed operation 2 valleys over, thin and skittish, followed soon after by a pair of mules abandoned along a stretch of highway during a family's desperate relocation. The riders bring supplies, labor, and a rotating presence of volunteers who repair fencing, deepen the irrigation pond with new channels engineered to catch what little rain the season allows, and slowly, without ceremony, turn the quiet monument of her grief into a working shelter with a purpose larger than her own solitude. The adjustment is not without cost. Marcella spends the first weeks flinching at unfamiliar footsteps on her property, retreating to the kitchen window at the sound of new voices in the yard. Relearning by inches how to share a space she spent 3 years guarding as hers alone. There are nights she sits on the porch long after the last volunteer has driven off down the dark road, aching with an exhaustion that has less to do with labor than with the strange, unfamiliar work of letting people in. It is Iris, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, who finally says aloud what Marcella has avoided naming. Standing beside her one evening at the fence line, watching a young gelding test its legs in the newly repaired paddock, she observes, without softening it, that grief kept sealed in an empty room stays exactly the size of the room, and that Marcella's barn was never actually empty, only waiting for her to decide it could hold something new without losing what it once held. Marcella does not answer that directly. She watches the gelding instead. It's uncertain, testing steps across ground that has not felt a horse's weight in years, and something in her posture, some old tension she has carried since the day she sold the last of her husband's animals, eases by a fraction that does not require words to be understood. There are harder nights before the winter settles in fully. A colt arrives sick from a ranch 2 counties north, and Marcella sits up 3 nights running in a stall she once swept clean out of habit, learning again the particular exhaustion of caring for something that might not survive the caring. When the colt finally steadies, she does not celebrate the way the younger riders do, whooping and slapping each other's shoulders in the cold paddock light. She stands quietly at the stall door instead, one hand resting on the colt's damp neck, and lets herself feel, for the first time and longer than she can measure, the specific relief of having fought for something and won. Word of the shelter spread slowly through the valley's thin network of ranch families, carried the same way news of Kincaid's overreach once was, mouth to mouth along roads too remote for anything faster. A few of her older neighbors, people who kept a cautious distance during her years of solitude, begin stopping by unannounced with supplies or spare hands, awkward at first in their reacquaintance with a woman they had quietly written off as lost to her grief. Marcella receives them without much fanfare, setting them to work rather than making conversation, though she notices, some evenings, the particular pleasure of a full table at dinner where for 3 years there had only ever been one plate. One neighbor, an older widower named Hollis who lost his own small herd 2 summers back, lingers longer than the rest one evening, watching Marcella move between stalls with an ease that seems to surprise him more than it surprises her. He tells her, haltingly, that he always assumed her silence these past years meant she wanted to be left entirely alone, and that he regrets not testing that assumption sooner. She does not offer him easy forgiveness for the distance, nor does she pretend the years of isolation were only ever imposed on her from outside. She simply hands him a feed bucket and points him toward the far stall, and the two of them work in a silence that carries, for the first time in a long while, something closer to companionship than avoidance. Autumn arrives late that year, but arrives fully, the first real rain in 14 months breaking over the ridgeline on a gray afternoon that empties the valley's roads and fills every dry channel within an hour. Marcella stands in it without shelter, in the middle of the yard, letting it soak through her shirt in a way she has not allowed herself to feel joy about anything in longer than she can measure. Leland returns twice more before the year ends. once to check on a mare recovering from the strangles outbreak that finally burns itself out across the region, and once without any medical excuse at all, arriving simply to sit on the same overturned crate near the same stall door, watching Marcella work with the quiet, undemanding presence of a man who has learned not to rush what deserves time. He does not carve anything new into her barn wall. The first mark remains where he left it, weathered now by a season of rain, still legible beneath the graying wood. The old mare arrives in early winter, delivered by Otis himself on a morning cold enough to fog every breath in the yard. She is gray-muzzled, stiff in the joints, moving with the careful deliberation of an animal well past her working years, and Marcella recognizes her before Otis says a word, recognizes the particular white marking above the left eye that her husband once described, years ago, as the mare's signature, back when this same animal belonged to her family before hard years forced a sale long before Thomas Vance ever entered her life. The riders found her 3 counties over, neglected and nearly forgotten, and traced her lineage back through old breeding records with the same patient diligence they bring to every rescue. Marcella does not manage words when the mare is led into the yard. She stands with one hand pressed against the animal's neck for a long time, the cold air sharp in her chest, the barn behind her full now with the sounds of horses she did not expect to hear again. And something in her finally releases that 3 years of careful, guarded solitude had held rigid and unspoken. There is one afternoon in late winter when Marcella finds herself alone in the barn, the volunteers gone home, the horses settled, and she walks the length of the stalls the way she used to when they were empty, trailing a hand along each door. She stops longest at the 4th stall, the one nearest the tack room, where the old gray mare stands dozing in the pale light, and she stays there until the light fades entirely, not out of sadness this time, but because some part of her still needs to confirm, again and again, that the sound of breathing animals in this space is not something she imagined into being out of desperation. She writes Thomas's name once that winter, in a ledger she has started keeping for the shelter's records, not as an entry but in the margin, the way a person marks a page they intend to return to. She does not explain the gesture to anyone, and no one asks. Iris finds her there once, pen still in hand, and says nothing beyond offering to help carry the next morning's feed, a small kindness that asks for no explanation and receives none. The valley below the mountains does not stop being hard. The drought breaks only partway. The ranches around her continue their slow, uncertain struggle against a landscape that gives less each year than it once did, and Kincaid, diminished but not destroyed, remains a name spoken with caution rather than fear whenever county business brings his interests near the hollow again. Marcella carries her own losses forward too, the years she spent alone that cannot be returned to her, the version of herself that might have opened this barn sooner if grief had allowed it, the quiet ache that never fully leaves a person who has buried someone they built a whole life around. But the barn stands full now, and the mark in the wood beside the tack room door remains, and on cold mornings when frost silvers the paddock fence, riders come down from the mountains along the same road where a black horse once collapsed in the heat, bringing animals that need saving and news that needs carrying, and Marcella meets them at the gate the way she has learned, slowly and at real cost, to meet anything worth keeping. What began as one woman's last bucket of water became a shelter that now stretches across an entire valley's worth of quiet, unspoken debts finally answered. Marcella Vance did not choose compassion because it was easy or because she expected anything in return. She chose it because a dying animal and a collapsed stranger were in front of her, and the alternative was a kind of silence she had already spent 3 years living inside. The bridges built that afternoon, between a grieving widow and a network of strangers she had never asked to need, remind us that the smallest acts of mercy, offered at the moment we can least afford them, are often the only currency strong enough to hold a community together when everything else runs dry. If this story found you tonight, carry its water forward, and remember that the people who give when they have almost nothing left are usually the ones who end up rebuilding everything.